This is Climate Dialogues, where we speak to climate leaders on key decisions and outcomes during the 2023 Africa Climate Summit. I am Saida Swale. Thank you very much, Anne, for making time for us. Please briefly tell us a bit about yourself and the work FEMNET is doing when it comes to climate justice.
Thank you so much, Saida. Like you said, my name is Antek. I'm the Climate Justice Coordinator with FEMNET. Antek is a climate change activist. At the same time, I have a background of environment and natural resources, but a lot on climate justice. I've done a lot of work with climate justice for the past 15 years. My work with FEMNET is basically, FEMNET first is a feminist movement in Africa. So we bring together organizations, feminist organizations, women-led organizations, women movements on issues of women's rights. So we are looking at economic rights, sexual and reproductive rights. We are looking at leadership and also young girls' development. But specifically for this reason, we have a climate justice movement in Africa. So what FEMNET does is advocacy around climate justice issues within the region and looking at the vulnerable groups, especially women and young girls.
Very nice. So if you were to briefly explain to us some of your key takeaways from the post-Africa Climate Summit 2023, what would you like to say?
I look at it as, first, it was a reflection on where we are as Africans when it comes to climate change issues, then looking at what do we want. So in terms of where we were, we looked at what are our challenges internally as Africans. We're looking at issues of, we are one of the countries or regions that have the most of natural resources. We are looking at renewable energy within the region. We have one of the largest forests within the region, like the Congo forest. So we contribute in terms of reducing the emissions within the region. We have a large workforce when it comes to the youth. So we are endowed with resources as Africans, but we still face a big impact when it comes to climate change. You're aware that in Africa, we contribute the least, less than 4% in climate change, but yet we get the most impact. So during the climate summit, some of the issues that were discussed was, the commitments that were made during the COP27, like the reduction of the emission. The IPCC has already said that we could surpass the 1.5 degrees Celsius. So what are we doing in terms of reducing the emissions? So the call was, how should we then reduce the emission? There's need to reduce those emissions, especially for the developed countries. The other thing was commitment in terms of climate finance. During the COP in Copenhagen, where the developed countries committed to give $100 billion annually. So we were pushing to ensure that that commitment is made. So as Africans, we feel that that commitment is yet to be made. So those were the outcomes of the summit. And lastly, the issues of loss and damage. Remember in COP27, the loss and damage framework was passed. Going to COP29, there was the issue of now the implementation of the COP, of the loss and damage funds. So we were really pushing to ensure that we have funds, and it's been given to the most vulnerable one, especially in the vulnerable countries in Africa.
Mm-hmm. And so, how do you, as a FEMNET, actually define climate justice?
Climate justice for us is how do we address the issues of climate justice looking at the vulnerable groups? Like I mentioned, we have the indigenous people, we have the people living with disability, we have the women and young girls. When we're addressing issues of climate justice, of climate change, how are the vulnerable people being supported, especially when it comes to climate finance? Like I said, how are they receiving the capacity that they need? So justice in terms of, while addressing climate change, how are the vulnerable groups being supported?
Okay. You've mentioned it's interesting you mentioned the vulnerable groups, but we'd also like to know some of the impacts of climate justice on local communities within the African context.
A lot. Like I said, we emit the least, yet we are most impacted. One is because Africa depends on the agriculture as one of the backbones for our economies. So you find that most of the vulnerable groups depend on agriculture to survive. And this is the sector that is most affected by climate change. If you look at water, climate affects water availability and even issues of sanitation. So when there are impacts of climate change, these are the people who go for long distances to get water. Our women, our children go long distances to get water. We go for long distances to get food, to fetch firewood. So this is the continent that is also rich in natural resources like wildlife. But when there are long droughts, the wildlife is being affected. So we don't get to feed our economy. Like in Kenya, we depend a lot on wildlife for our GDP. So when there's a lot of drought, when there are impacts of climate change, we suffer, not just, resource-wise, but also economically. If you look at issues of forest as well, because of dryness, there's a lot of forest fires, there's a lot of encroachment within the region. So those are the impacts you're talking about when it comes to the African region.
It's interesting you mentioned the burden and the challenges faced by the girl child and the women, but then what role does the woman play in the African context in terms of when it comes to climate justice?
First, I also did mention that the woman also plays a big role in the labor within the house. I mean, even the workload within the house. Remember, there's the unpaid care work. This is a person who, when people are out there, they take a lot of time working the house, but that role is not being recognized. But the role of the woman, like I said, is to provide water, to care for people. To provide food, to provide firewood, to care for the vulnerable in the household, like the sick, the aged, the children. So during this disaster time, they have a lot of burden compared to the male counterpart who can just go out, look for other means of survival. So that's why we focus a lot on women and young girls.
All right. And so do you think it will be important to have some policy changes in order to have the role of women and their involvement in climate justice?
A lot. And I know as FEMNET, we've been advocating for the implementation of the Lima Work Program on gender. That's the UNFCCC framework that defines how gender is mainstream into UNFCCC processes and its action plan as well. So some of the components within the Lima Work Plan is supporting capacity building, supporting financing, supporting technology for women. So for us is to ensure that first, countries have their own specific policies in terms of climate change, but not just policies, but gender sensitive policies. Like it has to have a gender lens, both at the regional, at the national, and even at the subnational level. So as FEMNET, we've been pushing to ensure that countries not just have policies, but policies that also address gender issues, that they also have what we call climate change gender action plan within the countries. So that is our role in terms of pushing for policies within the climate change space.
And how do you ensure that your work also goes hand in hand with what the men are doing out here in terms of, you're speaking about gender balance, but how are you working together to bring this out?
Yeah, men play a key role because you cannot talk about gender without involving men. Gender cuts across.
Yeah.
It's only that women are more vulnerable than the male counterparts. So in our conversation, we ensure that we also bring on board the male counterpart, the men within the climate change space, so that when we are discussing these issues, they're able to also push on our behalf.
Okay, very interesting. And so how do you involve the youth as well in issues when it comes to climate injustice and climate justice per se?
Yeah, good question, because even during the climate summit and Africa Climate Week, the issues of youth and children were really, came out, including women. So we know very well that Africa has a youthful population. And we cannot talk about climate change if we are not involving the youth, because these are the people they're the ones that people say future, but they're the leaders of today. So in our work, that's why we have the young girls program, the teenage and young girls program within FEMNET. So we do involve them to ensure that they are represented in leadership. They also have, they're supported in terms of climate finance. They do have money to implement real actions on the ground. And I've seen that happen in most of the countries. Youth are now defining the climate change space. They're the ones advocating through the online platforms. They're the ones planting trees. If you look at most of the programs, they're being actually led by youth. So we hope to really upscale and ensure that more youth are involved in this discussion.
Tell me a bit more about your program, the one you've just mentioned you're calling it the youth, the young ones program.
We have a young girls, we are calling it a young girls program within FEMNET, but within a program which we're implementing, which we are calling African Activists for Climate Justice, we have a youth component where we are now building a movement of youth within Africa. And we are also supporting youth related policies in climate change within Africa. We also have grants that target specifically youth organizations as well. Yes.
Initially, you mentioned issues on climate financing. And so how do you think the global finance system can affect climate efforts in Africa?
The climate change architect is a bit complicated, and that's why a lot of our work, a lot of our advocacy is on climate finance, because you cannot talk about addressing climate change without talking about climate finance. So there are a lot of funds that have been allocated for climate change, to address climate change, like the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Fund. We now have the Adaptation Fund. We have funds for the least developed countries, and we do have a fund now, what we're calling the Loss and Damage Fund. So our discussions or our advocacy has been a lot on how do we access this fund, because that has been a big debate. We do have funds, yes, but how many people have been able to tap into this fund? So the challenge has been the process. We find it, people take a long time to develop these proposals to tap into these funds. Not everybody has the capacity or the time to even go through those processes. So our advocacy has been around the accessibility and how much of this fund has come down. So we still find it very complicated, and that's why we advocate for governments to allocate their own funds, even as they look forward for these big grants. So and we know of some countries like Kenya, where they have a dedicated fund within the national kitty, but even at the subnational level, they've been able to allocate like at least 2% or 2% of their development funds at the subnational level to climate issues. So yeah, it's still a complicated process, but governments have found their way of going around it. Yeah.
What I'm hearing from you is more of collaborations, and how, in your opinion, what do you think can be done for civil societies to effectively collaborate with governments in order to enhance maybe climate justice?
Collaboration is key, not just with governments. There's need to collaborate first, even with, within the civil society itself. There's need to build that synergy. Then within governments and civil society, but also bring on board private sector. Private sector is one of the biggest funders when it comes to climate change. So we need to also bring them on board, the community, the media, and even, people of goodwill. Collaboration is key, because we've seen civil society drive climate change agenda within countries. Like, for example, in Nigeria and South Africa, where we work, it's the civil society, or even in Kenya, it's the civil society which developed their policies, their climate change policies. For Kenya, it was driven by the Climate Change Act of 2016, was driven by the civil society. And I'm glad that governments have really worked closely with the civil society to develop these frameworks. We've seen civil society and government working in terms of developing technical positions towards the UNFCCC processes, like COPs, like Substar. So, I mean, that technical support, that financial support to even be able to develop these policies or hold meetings. So I'm glad that is possible in some countries, but not in some of the countries.
Well put. And so, what are some of the challenges as FEMNET that you go through on a day-to-day basis when it comes to enhancing or promoting climate justice?
One is many people still don't understand climate justice. I mean, climate change generally. People think tree planting is climate change. You see a lot of people doing tree planting. So even defining the difference between climate change and environment. So that capacity for people to understand what really climate change is before even going to the details. The other issue is the bigger issue is the big thing is the financing, because you could be having programs, but you don't have anybody to finance. So we've been advocating to ensure that finances reach the vulnerable groups. The other issue is technology, because climate also comes with a lot of technology when it comes to agriculture, manufacturing, transport. You need that technology. So transfer of technology is also a big issue. And also partnership. We are not yet in synergy with the different actors. So there's need to build a synergy so that we're able to speak as one.
Okay. It's interesting you say that very many people still don't understand what climate change is. For the sake of our viewers, what is climate justice?
Okay. I would start with climate change. So climate change is change in weather patterns due to a change in the environment, especially because of the green gas emissions, so leading to global warming. So you would find that there is flooding, long droughts, there are cyclones, or even strong winds. So those long weather patterns within a period of time. So climate justice is how do we then address the issues of climate change, considering the vulnerable groups in the society. Like I said, the people living with disability, the indigenous groups, the women and the youth and the children. How do we address and ensure they are also being dealt with? So that is climate justice. Yeah.
Okay. As we try and figure that out, what do you think are some of the real world impacts of climate justice?
One of the way of addressing climate justice, the biggest is climate finance. So if the developed countries would then abide to their commitments, then that way would be a way of addressing climate issues. That is climate justice, because we feel as Africans or developed countries, we've contributed least to the greenhouse gas emissions. So those who contributed the most should then pay for that. So that is climate justice. So one way is financing. The second way is technology transfer. How do we then embrace the Western technology to ensure that the people in Africa are able to use those technologies in different sectors, like I mentioned? The other way is climate justice is also capacity building, ensuring that people are aware about this change so that they're able to adjust. So that's how I would define climate justice.
Okay. Do you think this is attainable, especially on the technology bit, being that in Africa we still have a major data challenge, and basically we're just taking a lot of time to get on board when it comes to technological issues?
It will, if there is goodwill also from the Western. If we are able to embrace as well, it's possible. So it's about that goodwill, and it's also about the process of transferring it. Yeah.
Okay. And how do you think natural resource governance ties into climate justice?
A lot. Natural resources, we are talking about water, we are talking about forests, we are talking about minerals, we are talking about gas. So it's key, because like I said, in Africa, we contribute like 40% of the renewable energy. But we find that we still have 60 billion Africans who are not yet connected with energy. So there's a close relationship between climate and natural resources. I talked about the carbon sinks. We do have one of the biggest forests. So we are able to tap into to reduce the emissions using our natural resources. So that then links the natural resources with climate change. We are talking about water. We still have enough water, but when it comes to dry seasons, we have water deficiency. So there's that close link between long droughts and water insufficiency, and also, issues of sanitation. Yes.
Okay. You mentioned the work that has been done by FEMNET when it comes to promoting climate justice. What more do you think African countries can do to help promote climate justice in their continent?
We found different ways of doing it. Like one, I said, movement building. We need a movement of people in Africa so that we're able to advocate for climate change justice. So if we have numbers, and that is the strategy we are using as FEMNET, if we are able to mobilize as many women and young girls as possible to speak about climate change issues, then we are able to address this issue. We just came from a meeting on called the Gender is My Agenda, GMAC forum, where now women within Africa, a movement of women in Africa advocating for gender issue rights. So climate change is one of the agenda. So if we are able to mobilize as many women as possible, as many youth as possible to advocate for climate change, that would be one of the strategy. The other thing is if we can tell our own African stories. You see, our way of challenges is different from other countries. So if we're able to tell our stories in terms of climate change, then we're able to influence policy. People are able to take action. So we've been able to support women to document their challenges when it comes to climate change. I'll give an example. In Mozambique, when there was flooding, women would have a lot of issues because for them to get food, men would trade sex for food during flooding time. So we would tell women, please tell your stories so that people can take actions from your stories. We do have a lot of work in terms of pushing for political goodwill through policies. So we've been able to support, like, for example, in some countries, to develop gender action plan or specific policies on climate change. So that is one of our strategies we are using. Through our partners, we have what we're calling small grants facilities, where we are now receiving grants from donors and giving it to communities so that they're able to take actions within the, at the community level.
I know we can spend the whole day talking about this, but
Yeah.
I'd like to know now, what are your future plans when it comes to climate justice?
Our future plan is first to grow the movement within the region. Also to sensitize as many communities as possible and to grow a big movement within the region. Our plan is also to ensure that this climate change funding reach the communities. So we are collaborating with partners to analyze how much is coming, but not just coming to Africa, but specifically to women. So that is one of our plans. Our plans is to also push our partners within our countries to ensure that they have policies within their countries. We are also working close with media to ensure that media is able to tell our stories. We're able to have forums to have such discussions within media spaces. We've had a lot of trainings with them so that they also understand this issue and they're able to tell stories on our behalf. We also want to build a lot of synergy within the region, work closely with African Union, work closely with the regional bodies like the East African Community, the SADC, and all those communities, so that we're able to influence policies on climate change within those regions. And more so to work at the grassroots level, because those are the people who really who need us, who need capacity, who need the financing. So we want to ensure that the Mama Mboga is able to tap into climate finance.
Your final thought?
Climate change is a big issue and it affects most of the sectors. In fact, I keep telling people there's nothing like climate change. It manifests in a sector. It manifests in agriculture. It manifests in water, in infrastructure, in education. So we cannot ignore. We just have to take action.
Thank you very much, Antek, for your time. You have given us very insightful thoughts. You've mentioned the youth, the power of the youth, power of the women, and telling our own African stories. Thank you very much. My name is Saida Swale. Thank you very much for tuning in to Climate Dialogues.